Okay, so today we're going to walk through a lesson on economics, which is a subject that I'm interested in teaching in the future. I'm going to do my best to explain assumptions that we would need to use for this lesson, as well as anticipate and encourage critical questions that students might have regarding the subject. So the specific topic that we're going to cover today is the law of supply and demand. Okay, and I'll try to make this as realistic as when I'm speaking to my students. So the first thing I would do when talking to my students about this idea is to get them to understand first the real world implications of this idea or concept. So I'd probably start with one of the two, and I would just get them to think about what dictates the price of something, because everyone in society is very well acquainted with the idea of price or cost. So when they go to the grocery store or maybe the mall or wherever they like to shop, the goods that they select always have a preset price. And that's not really anything they can change. But maybe one thing I would also suggest is that remember that as human beings, all of our concepts have been handed down to us through the ages, right? So they all have a specific history behind them. So I might ask the class if any of them have been to any other countries, for example, where they have open markets. And one thing anyone who's traveled in many different places throughout the world is they have kind of open markets where the price of a good is not necessarily as preset as it is in the United States, right? So there is maybe a suggested price, but then the buyer and the seller can negotiate, or sometimes we call it haggling, right, over another price. And that just depends on who makes the better argument and who's more willing maybe to walk away. If the buyer is more willing to walk away or the seller. Because both sides need to agree for a transaction to happen. Once we've gone over that kind of key underlying idea, I'll call it an assumption of price, right? Then we need to understand just what does it mean for someone to desire a good or service in the first place, right? So we'll start with the law of demand, because in economics, a lot of the concepts we learn both qualitatively with words, but also quantitatively, on a chart. So we'll start with the downward sloping demand curve, one of the most famous graphs or charts in all of economics. So the downward sloping demand curve, let's go over what this actually means, right? So on our two axes in economics, we always have to label those because there's two variables being measured here. So on the x-axis, this is going to be quantity. And on the y-axis is going to be price. So you'll notice what's going on here is as price is decreasing, right? Because that's what's really happening, right? On the y-axis, it means the quantity desired to purchase is increasing. It's going out to the right. So that is what we call an inverse relationship. And then beyond just explaining this concept, I want students to understand a couple assumptions. So economics is very interesting to me because it's not only about numbers or even ideas. It's really about a framework for looking at reality. And it's just one of many different frameworks that we have to consider simultaneously, right? There's other things like politics, philosophy, all other sorts of things we can talk about, but this is just one of them. Okay, so getting back to this, I want students to know a key assumption, and this would be a branching option, is that in economics, we assume that all participants are what we call rational actors. Okay, so this means that someone is going to choose what is logically correct. However, this is a major branching off point for critical discussion, because if anyone has a lot of experience in the world, there's definitely a lot of very intelligent, very rational people. Others may be less so, and maybe even the people we think are so rational can also make mistakes, right? Or be irrational under certain circumstances. So this is definitely a point that I would hope that students question me on. Is this true? Okay, and if that question comes up, I would walk students through it. Okay, another assumption that we need to discuss really quickly is in economics, this is a foundational idea, so hopefully I would have mentioned it in the class before this, is the concept of scarcity. Okay, so with scarcity, you might ask, well, why can't the price of everything just be very, very low, right? Maybe everyone would have everything they want. This is worth considering. We can't dismiss this out of hand, because who knows, maybe we've just making mistakes as societies throughout time. Maybe this would have been the better option. However, in economics, the answer to this is the idea of scarcity, that on the planet Earth, resources are finite, and also that desires are unlimited, right? So everyone would like to drive the nicest cars, have the biggest houses, etc. And the argument here, which again, certainly we can disagree with, which would be another branching point, is this argument true? And we can definitely discuss pros and cons with this as well. Okay, so far we've talked about definitely some bigger ideas, bigger picture thinking that we could hopefully discuss in a critical manner. But I'm also walking through the students. So I'll be employing what's called the think aloud strategy, which I will hope to use constantly in my classes because I think it'll be extremely important. So I'm going to use the think aloud strategy not only to draw my graphs, but also so that students understand why the graphs are shaped like they do. So I already do this in my teaching somewhat to this point, but I want to increase this amount in the future. Okay, so the idea behind the downward sloping demand curve is that if something has a high price, my money is limited, right? And therefore, if I know I have to pay a lot to get something, I'm less likely to actually buy it. That's why the quantity would be low at the high price. As the price goes down, more and more people would have enough money to buy it. This item is more affordable, we would call it. And then the quantity being purchased of this item would increase, logically. So far, this is a fairly logical concept, hopefully. Okay, so now we have to talk about what actually determines a price, because it's not just the law of demand, it's also the law of supply. There needs to be a buyer, which is the demand side, and a seller. So a seller has to do with the law of supply, and this is an upward sloping supply curve. So I always have a fun little, I guess, mnemonic for my students, which is demand goes down, they're both D, right? And then supply goes to the sky, right? So just a little alliteration to make sure that students don't have these flipped. Okay, so with the law of supply, it's kind of the opposite in a lot of ways from the law of demand. if something is very cheap, right? I, as a person who's trying to make a living, right? I would have to sell a lot of them to make a lot of money. So another key assumption in economics is the idea of incentive. So with the idea of incentive is the idea that people are motivated by money, which is one of the things they desire. Of course, people desire many other things as well, but this is just one of them. Okay, so a producer, when the price is low, not many people want to go into that job, right? If you're not going to be well compensated for your labor or your effort, why take the work to produce this good? The opposite is true the farther you go up the supply curve, right? The more money, let's just say you sell homemade shoes, right? If you could fetch a very high price for the shoes that you are making, maybe this is a labor of love for you, hopefully, then you'd be highly motivated in order to reap the greatest financial reward possible to make as many shoes as you can, right? You'd be trying to become a millionaire or something like that. So this would be the other side of the equation. And then price is simply the intersection. We call this the market equilibrium between the two. Okay, so this is the idea. We have an equilibrium price, P star, and we have an equilibrium quantity. So that's how much of something will be produced and at what price. The last branching option I want to discuss for this class today is in economics, there are always going to be counters or exceptions to the rule. So for this, there are certain maybe luxury goods. If you sold me a Louis Vuitton bag and you told me it was $10, maybe it would be a real bag, maybe not, but that would be so contrary to my expectations that you would probably actually sell less of them at that price, even though it's lower. A similar thing might be if you have a cheaper brand. So if you have an off-brand Kleenex versus the actual Kleenex brand tissue, right? Even though one might be cheaper than the other, as people do better in the economy or worse, they might actually buy the cheaper one less when they have more money because they have more money to buy the superior luxury good. So these are just a few types of exceptions to this rule. But one thing I would always, so this is a branching option because students should definitely question me on this. What about these, right? There's always going to be a certain amount of exceptions. But the idea, again, that hopefully I said before, is that economics is not just about particular numbers, but it's what a general way, of looking at the world. So yes, there will always be exceptions to the rule. Okay, so that's my video. Thank you for listening.